mist-shrouded glens, their granite peaks bearing silent witness to millennia of human struggle against both nature and invader. These formidable landscapes, characterized by deep glacial valleys, treacherous bogs, and windswept moorlands, created a crucible that forged one of Europe's most distinctive cultures. A people whose fierce independence and cultural resilience would echo through centuries of conflict, persecution, and ultimately, transformation. The archaeological record reveals human presence in the highlands stretching back to the Mesolithic period, approximately 8,500 years before the present era, when hunter-gatherer communities first ventured into territories recently liberated from the retreat of massive ice sheets. These earliest inhabitants left behind scattered flint tools and shell middens along coastal areas, suggesting seasonal exploitation of marine resources that complemented terrestrial hunting. However, the foundations of recognizably highland culture emerged during the later prehistoric periods, when successive waves of Celtic-speaking peoples brought with them not merely new languages and technologies, but entire worldviews that would shape highland society for millennia. The Celtic tribes who settled the highlands between approximately 800 BC and 100 AD brought sophisticated ironworking techniques, complex social hierarchies, and spiritual practices deeply intertwined with the dramatic natural landscapes surrounding them. Unlike the more densely populated lowland regions where agricultural potential encouraged concentrated settlements, the highland environment demanded dispersed patterns of habitation adapted to the challenging terrain. Communities established themselves in sheltered glens where thin soils permitted limited cultivation of hardy grains, while extensive upland pastures supported the cattle herds that became central to highland economic and social systems. The process of Celtic settlement involved both displacement and assimilation of earlier Bronze Age populations, creating cultural syntheses that incorporated ancient traditions while establishing new patterns of social organization centered around kinship networks that would eventually evolve into the clan system. Highland Iron Age society organized itself around fortified settlements that demonstrated both defensive considerations and status display. Brocks, massive circular stone towers unique to northern Scotland, dominated strategic positions throughout the highlands and islands, their sophisticated dry stone construction techniques creating defensive structures that could shelter entire extended family groups during periods of conflict. At sites like Dun Telve and Glen Elg, these remarkable structures reached heights exceeding 40 feet, their double-walled construction incorporating galleries, stairs, and storage chambers that testified to advanced architectural knowledge. Archaeological excavations reveal that brocks served not merely military functions but also acted as centers for craft production and trade, with discoveries of Roman artifacts indicating participation in long-distance exchange networks that connected highland communities with the broader Roman world despite the region's position beyond imperial frontiers. The tribal groups inhabiting the highlands during the late Iron Age and early Roman periods included the Caledons, whose name would eventually provide the Latin designation Caledonia for the entire region beyond Roman control. Roman sources describe these northern tribes as fierce warriors who painted their bodies with woad and organized themselves according to kinship-based social structures that recognized warrior elites, but lacked the centralized political authority characteristic of lowland kingdoms. The Caledonii occupied territories encompassing much of the central and eastern highlands, establishing their power bases in areas where agricultural potential supported larger populations capable of fielding significant military forces. Their settlements featured substantial roundhouses constructed with stone foundations and timber superstructures, surrounded by defensive earthworks that enclosed agricultural fields and livestock enclosures essential for sustaining communities through harsh highland winters. The Vaco Magi controlled the northeastern approaches to the highlands, their territories encompassing fertile valleys where the highland massif descended toward the coastal plains. This intermediate position between highland and lowland environments created distinctive cultural characteristics that blended highland warrior traditions with more intensive agricultural practices possible in their more favorable territories. Archaeological evidence suggests the Vaco Magi maintained extensive trade relationships with both their highland neighbors and the Romanized populations to the south, positioning themselves as intermediaries who facilitated exchange while maintaining their cultural distinctiveness. Their hill forts occupied commanding positions overlooking major routeways, strategic placements that enabled control over trade and movement, while providing defensive advantages against potential enemies from any direction. The Epidii occupied the Kintyre Peninsula and adjacent islands, their maritime orientation distinguishing them from more inland highland tribes. Their economy depended heavily on marine resources, including fish, seals, and shellfish, supplemented by limited agriculture in sheltered coastal valleys and extensive cattle herding on upland pastures. The Epidei's naval capabilities enabled them to maintain communications across sea channels that often provided more reliable transportation than overland routes through difficult terrain. Their boat-building traditions, utilizing hides stretched over wooden frames to create sturdy vessels capable of navigating treacherous coastal waters, represented technological adaptations that would influence Highland maritime culture for centuries. Archaeological discoveries of elaborate metalwork and imported goods at Epidei sites indicate prosperity derived from controlling strategic sea routes connecting Ireland, western Scotland, and the Atlantic approaches. Highland society during the Late Iron Age operated according to complex social hierarchies headed by chieftains or kings who derived authority from both martial prowess and spiritual legitimacy. These leaders commanded personal followings of warriors bound to them through obligations of loyalty and mutual support. Relationships formalized through gift-giving, feasting, and participation in cattle raids that served both economic and social functions. Below the warrior elite, free farmers worked land held according to customary tenure, their agricultural production supporting both their own families and the warrior classes through tribute obligations. Skilled craftsmen, including blacksmiths, bronze workers, and jewelers, occupied positions of elevated status due to their specialized knowledge, their creations serving both practical functions and status display. At the bottom of the social hierarchy, slaves captured in warfare or born into bondage performed agricultural labor and domestic tasks that sustained the entire social system. Celtic religion permeated every aspect of Highland life during the Late Iron Age, with Druids serving as priests, judges, teachers, and repositories of oral tradition. These learned individuals underwent extensive training lasting decades, memorizing vast quantities of genealogical, legal, and religious knowledge that they transmitted orally across generations. Sacred groves, springs, hilltops, and caves served as centers of worship where Highland communities made offerings to deities associated with warfare, fertility, healing, and natural phenomena. The landscapes themselves possessed spiritual significance, with particular mountains, lochs, and glens regarded as dwelling places of supernatural beings whose favor required careful propitiation. The lack of written records from this period creates significant gaps in our understanding of Highland religious beliefs, but archaeological evidence of ritual deposits, including weapons, jewelry, and even human remains, in bogs and water bodies, suggests sophisticated cosmological understandings that connected the human realm with supernatural dimensions through ritual action. The Roman conquest of Britain, initiated by Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, fundamentally altered the political landscape of the entire island while creating new pressures on Highland societies that had previously operated in relative isolation. Initial Roman military objectives focused on securing the fertile lowlands of southern and central Britain, but the presence of unconquered Highland tribes beyond the frontier posed constant threats to Roman settlements and trade routes. Roman military commanders recognized that the Highland terrain presented unique challenges fundamentally different from those encountered in Gaul or the Mediterranean world. The absence of substantial urban centers meant traditional Roman conquest strategies, which relied on capturing cities and co-opting local elites, proved ineffective in regions where political authority remained diffused among numerous small-scale societies. The mountainous topography favored defensive warfare and guerrilla tactics, enabling Highland warriors to strike Roman patrols and supply columns before melting back into familiar territories where disciplined legionary formations could not effectively pursue them. The first major Roman military expedition into Highland territories occurred under Governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola between 79 and 84 AD, representing the most sustained attempt to subjugate the Caledonian tribes. Agricola brought extensive military experience from campaigns in Britain and continental Europe, recognizing that Highland conquest required systematic approaches different from conventional Roman military operations. His strategy combined coordinated advances by land and sea forces, with the Roman fleet providing supplies and outflanking Highland defensive positions, while legionary columns methodically constructed forts and roads that extended Roman control northward. The construction of fortified installations at regular intervals created supply networks and strategic bases that enabled Roman forces to maintain continuous pressure on highland communities despite the logistical challenges posed by difficult terrain and extended supply lines. The Caledonian response to Roman invasion initially followed patterns of localized resistance, with individual tribes defending their territories using traditional warfare methods that proved inadequate against Roman military superiority. However, the sustained Roman advance under Agricola's methodical leadership prompted unprecedented coordination among highland tribes that had previously competed among themselves. A Caledonian leader named Calgacus emerged as the primary organizer of unified resistance, his personal authority and rhetorical abilities convincing disparate tribal groups to subordinate their traditional rivalries in favor of coordinated opposition to Roman conquest. The Roman historian Tacitus, who was Agricola's son-in-law and thus had access to detailed campaign information, provides the only contemporary account of these events, though his narrative reflects Roman biases and literary conventions that complicate historical interpretation. The decisive confrontation between Roman forces and the Caledonian Confederacy occurred at Mons Graupius in 83 or 84 AD, a battle whose exact location remains subject to scholarly debate, but likely occurred somewhere in the eastern highlands where terrain permitted the large-scale engagement involving approximately 30,000 Caledonian warriors facing a Roman army of similar size. Calgacus positioned his forces on elevated ground, traditional Celtic tactical doctrine that utilized terrain advantages, while maximizing the psychological impact of massed warriors visible to enemies below. Tacitus attributes to Calgacus a powerful speech condemning Roman imperialism in terms that have resonated through subsequent centuries. They create a desolation and call it peace. Whether Calgacus actually delivered these words or Tacitus invented them according to classical rhetorical conventions, the sentiment captured enduring highland resistance to external domination. The battle commenced with exchanges of missile fire, javelins and arrows, before Roman auxiliary infantry advanced uphill against the Caledonian position. The Highland warriors, fighting with long swords and small shields, initially held their ground against the auxiliary assault, their superior position and fierce determination enabling effective resistance. However, Agricola's tactical reserves, disciplined legionary cohorts held back from the initial assault, gradually enveloped the Caledonian flanks while Roman cavalry exploited gaps in the Highland line created by the intensive fighting. The Caledonian formation disintegrated under this coordinated pressure, transforming organized resistance into chaotic retreat as warriors fled into surrounding hills and forests. Roman sources claim 10,000 Caledonian dead against only 360 Roman casualties, figures that likely represent propagandistic exaggeration, but nonetheless indicate a decisive Roman tactical victory. Despite this battlefield success, the strategic consequences of Mons Graupius proved remarkably limited. Agricola's recall to Rome shortly after the battle, motivated by Emperor Domitian's jealousy of his general's achievements, prevented consolidation of Roman control over newly conquered highland territories. Roman forces gradually withdrew southward, abandoning the network of forts and roads that had extended Roman authority into the highlands during Agricola's campaigns. The practical difficulties of maintaining garrison forces in hostile territory hundreds of miles from major supply bases, combined with military pressures on other frontier regions, convinced subsequent Roman administrations that permanent highland conquest exceeded practical capabilities. The experience demonstrated that while Roman forces could defeat highland armies in conventional battles, the dispersed nature of highland society and the protective characteristics of the terrain rendered conquest essentially unachievable through available military means. The construction of the Antonine Wall around 142 AD represented a renewed Roman attempt to extend imperial control northward, though even this more modest objective proved unsustainable. Built approximately 100 miles north of Hadrian's Wall across the narrow isthmus between the Firth of Forth and Firth of Clyde, the Antonine Wall consisted of a turf rampart atop stone foundations, fronted by a substantial ditch and supported by a series of forts housing garrison troops. The wall's construction required enormous labor inputs, mobilizing both legionary soldiers and impressed local populations to move millions of cubic feet of earth and stone. However, the strategic logic behind the Antonine Wall remained questionable, as it merely pushed the frontier forward without fundamentally altering the underlying impossibility of controlling the vast highland territories beyond. Roman forces abandoned the Antonine Wall after only 20 years, withdrawing once again to Hadrian's Wall, which would remain the effective northern limit of Roman Britain for the remainder of the imperial period. The Severan campaigns of the early 3rd century AD represented the final major Roman military efforts in highland territories, though like previous expeditions, they achieved temporary tactical successes without establishing permanent strategic control. Emperor Septimius Severus personally led massive forces into Caledonia in 208 AD. His advanced age and deteriorating health not preventing him from pursuing military glory on the northern frontier. The campaigns involved systematic devastation of highland territories, with Roman forces burning settlements, destroying crops, and slaughtering livestock in attempts to compel Caledonian submission through economic warfare. These brutal tactics inflicted tremendous suffering on highland communities while demonstrating Roman determination to punish resistance. Yet they failed to achieve lasting pacification. Severus died at York in 211 AD, and his successor Caracalla quickly negotiated peace with highland tribes, accepting tribute and hostages while withdrawing Roman forces back behind Hadrian's Wall. The experience of Roman military pressure fundamentally influenced highland social and political development during the succeeding centuries. The threat of Roman invasion encouraged greater coordination among highland tribes, creating precedents for supertribal political cooperation that would eventually contribute to the emergence of larger political entities. The military challenges posed by Roman forces accelerated adoption of iron weapons and improved metalworking techniques, while exposure to Roman material culture through trade and warfare introduced new technologies and luxury goods that became incorporated into highland status systems. However, the highland populations never experienced the intensive Romanization that transformed lowland Britain, remaining largely untouched by urban development, monetized economies, and Roman legal systems that fundamentally altered societies within the empire. This relative isolation from Roman cultural influence meant highland communities preserved Celtic social structures, languages, and cultural practices that had largely disappeared in Romanized regions. The withdrawal of Roman administration from Britain in the early 5th century AD created profound instability throughout the former province, with power vacuums filled by competing warlords, invading Germanic peoples, and indigenous populations attempting to reestablish political order. In the highlands and adjacent territories, this period witnessed the emergence of distinct political entities that would shape Scottish history for centuries. The Picts, whose name derived from the Latin picti meaning painted people, a reference to their practice of body decoration, dominated the eastern and northern highlands along with adjacent lowland territories. The origins of the Pictish people remain subject to scholarly debate, but they appear to represent cultural continuity from Iron Age Caledonian tribes. Their distinctive art styles, symbol stones, and political structures developing from earlier traditions while adapting to post-Roman circumstances. Pictish society organized itself around numerous small kingdoms that periodically coalesced under more powerful overkings who could temporarily impose their authority over subordinate rulers. The Picts left no written records in their own language, our knowledge of their political history deriving primarily from external sources, primarily Irish annals and later medieval Scottish chronicles, that provide fragmentary and often contradictory information. The Pictish language itself remains poorly understood, with only personal names and place name elements surviving as evidence of a tongue that appears to have included Celtic elements alongside possible pre-Celtic linguistic substrates. The mysterious Pictish symbol stones, elaborately carved monuments featuring enigmatic symbols alongside Christian crosses, testify to sophisticated artistic traditions and cultural practices whose precise meanings remain subjects of ongoing scholarly investigation. The Gaelic-speaking peoples known as Scoti, who would eventually give their name to Scotland itself, established the Kingdom of Dalriada in the Western Highlands and adjacent Irish territories during the late 5th or early 6th centuries AD. These Gaelic colonists from northeastern Ireland brought their language, cultural practices, and political structures to territories already inhabited by indigenous populations, creating cultural fusions that blended Irish and indigenous Highland traditions. Dalriada's political center lay in the Argyll region, with the fortress of Dunad serving as a royal stronghold and ceremonial center, where kings underwent inauguration rituals that combined Christian elements with older Celtic traditions. The kingdom maintained close connections with Ireland across the narrow sea channels that facilitated cultural and political exchange, with Dalriada's ruling dynasties participating in Irish politics while gradually establishing their power bases in Scottish territories. The Christianization of the highlands occurred through both indigenous developments and external missions during the 5th through 7th centuries, fundamentally transforming highland religious life while adapting to existing social structures. St. Columba's mission to Dalriada in 563 AD represented the most significant external Christian influence, though Christian communities likely existed in some highland areas before his arrival. Columba, an Irish nobleman and monk, established his monastery on the small island of Iona off the western coast of Mull, creating a religious center that would become one of medieval Europe's most important spiritual and cultural institutions. The monastery's remote location might seem to contradict its subsequent influence, but Iona's position actually provided strategic advantages, accessible by sea from both Ireland and Scotland while removed from political centers where secular conflicts might compromise monastic independence. Columba's approach to Christian mission emphasized working through existing political authorities, establishing close relationships with Pictish and Dalriatan kings whose conversion facilitated broader social acceptance of the new faith. The saint's biography, written by a Domnan approximately a century after Columba's death, portrays him as a powerful figure whose spiritual authority commanded respect from secular rulers while his miracles demonstrated Christianity's supernatural power. Whether these miracle accounts represent historical events or hagiographic conventions designed to promote Columba's cult, they reveal perceptions of how Christianity established itself in Highland society, not through violent suppression of older beliefs, but through gradual demonstration of superior spiritual power that convinced communities to embrace the new faith while maintaining cultural continuity. Celtic Christianity as practiced in Highland monasteries developed distinctive characteristics that differentiated it from Roman ecclesiastical traditions, creating tensions that would eventually require resolution through institutional reforms. Highland monasteries operated according to rules emphasizing extreme asceticism, with monks following regimens that included manual labor, perpetual prayer, and strict dietary restrictions that tested physical endurance while cultivating spiritual discipline. Unlike the episcopal structure that characterized Roman Christianity, with its hierarchical organization centered on bishops governing defined territorial dioceses, Celtic Christianity emphasized monastic authority, with abbots exercising primary religious leadership while bishops performed purely sacramental functions without administrative power. This organizational difference reflected broader cultural distinctions between Roman imperial traditions that emphasized hierarchical bureaucratic structures and Celtic social organizations based on kinship networks and personal loyalties. The monastery at Iona became a center of learning and artistic production, whose cultural influence extended far beyond the highlands during the early medieval period. The monastic scriptorium produced illuminated manuscripts that represented pinnacles of early medieval artistic achievement, with works like the Book of Kells, though likely completed in Ireland, demonstrating the sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities and technical skills cultivated in Highland monastic communities. Monks at Iona and daughter foundations maintained libraries that preserved not only Christian texts but also elements of pre-Christian Gaelic literature, including genealogies, legal traditions, and poetic compositions that might otherwise have been lost during the transition to Christianity. The monastery's educational programs trained generations of religious and secular leaders, with students from Ireland, Scotland, and even continental Europe traveling to study at this remote institution whose reputation for learning transcended geographical isolation. The political consolidation that created the Kingdom of Alba during the 9th century represented a transformative development that united Pictish and Gaelic territories under a single monarchy, laying foundations for eventual Scottish national identity. The process of unification remains obscured by limited documentary sources, but appears to have involved both military conquest and dynastic marriages that gradually merged the ruling houses of Dalriada and Pictland. Kenneth MacAlpin, traditionally credited with uniting the kingdoms around 843 AD, probably represented the culmination of longer processes of political integration rather than a sudden conqueror who forcibly merged distinct polities. The union involved not merely political amalgamation but also cultural synthesis, with Gaelic language and cultural practices gradually displacing Pictish equivalents throughout the United Kingdom, though whether this occurred through peaceful cultural assimilation or more violent suppression remains debated. The Viking raids that began devastating Highland coastal areas during the late 8th century profoundly disrupted existing political and economic systems while creating new challenges and opportunities that reshaped Highland society. Norse longships first appeared in Scottish waters in the 790s, their shallow drafts enabling navigation up rivers and lochs, while their seaworthy construction permitted rapid strikes against coastal monasteries and settlements. These initial raids targeted religious communities whose accumulated wealth in precious metals, religious objects, and valuable manuscripts made them irresistible targets for raiders who possessed intimate knowledge of maritime navigation but limited agricultural resources in their Scandinavian homelands. The attack on Iona in 795 AD represented one of the earliest documented Viking raids in the highlands, though the monastery's exposed coastal position ensured repeated assaults that eventually forced the community to relocate valuable possessions and sacred relics to safer inland locations. Viking settlement in the highlands and islands followed patterns distinct from their temporary raiding activities, with Norse colonists establishing permanent communities in Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, and portions of the western mainland coast. These settlers brought their families, livestock, and agricultural practices, creating Scandinavian cultural enclaves that maintained connections with Norway while gradually adapting to local Scottish conditions. The Norse earldom of Orkney became a major political power that dominated northern Scotland, its rulers exercising authority over territories that extended far beyond the island archipelago to include substantial portions of the northern Highland mainland. The cultural influence of Norse settlement remained evident in place names throughout these regions, with Scandinavian linguistic elements revealing the extent of Viking colonization even in areas where subsequent Gaelic resurgence eventually displaced Norse language and culture. The relationship between Highland Gaelic populations and Norse settlers evolved from initial violent conflict toward more complex patterns of competition, cooperation, and cultural exchange. In the Hebrides and western coastal regions, intermarriage between Norse incomers and indigenous Gaelic populations created hybrid communities whose culture blended Scandinavian and Celtic elements. These Gaelic Norse peoples eventually became known as the Galgael, literally foreign Gaels, maintaining Scandinavian connections while adopting Gaelic language and participating in Highland political structures. The Kingdom of the Isles, which emerged in the Hebrides during the 12th century under Norse Gaelic rulers, represented the culmination of this cultural synthesis, creating a maritime power that controlled strategic sea routes connecting Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia, while maintaining a distinctive cultural identity that drew on both Celtic and Scandinavian traditions. The consolidation of royal authority in medieval Scotland during the 11th through 13th centuries involved ongoing tensions between centralizing monarchs and Highland chiefs, who resisted incorporation into feudal political structures that contradicted traditional forms of social organization. Scottish kings based in the lowlands attempted to extend their authority northward and westward through a combination of military expeditions, feudal land grants to loyal followers, and diplomatic arrangements with cooperative Highland leaders. However, the geographical barriers separating highlands from lowlands, combined with fundamental cultural differences between Gaelic Highland society and the increasingly anglicized lowland culture, created persistent difficulties in achieving effective royal control over Highland territories. The reign of Malcolm III, 1058 to 1093, initiated processes of cultural and political change that gradually distanced royal authority from Highland Gaelic traditions. Malcolm's marriage to Margaret, an English princess who brought continental European cultural influences to the Scottish court, encouraged adoption of Norman feudal institutions and ecclesiastical practices that aligned Scotland with broader European norms while marginalizing traditional Highland customs. The Queen's religious reforms sought to bring Scottish church practices into conformity with Roman standards, eliminating distinctive Celtic Christian traditions that had characterized Highland monasticism. These ecclesiastical changes provoked resentment in Highland regions where traditional practices retained strong support, creating religious tensions that reinforced broader cultural divisions between Highlands and Lowlands. The introduction of Norman feudalism during the 12th century fundamentally altered land tenure systems and political relationships in territories controlled by royal authority, though Highland regions largely resisted incorporation into feudal structures. Scottish kings granted extensive estates to Norman and Anglo-Norman aristocrats who established castles, imported settlers, and imposed feudal obligations on populations that had previously organized themselves according to kinship-based social systems. In the lowlands and southern regions, this feudalization proceeded relatively smoothly, transforming social relationships and creating a new aristocracy loyal to royal authority. However, Highland chiefs generally rejected feudal subordination, maintaining traditional patterns of land tenure based on kinship rather than feudal contract. Their authority deriving from clan membership rather than royal grant. The development of the clan system during the medieval period represented highland responses to both internal social evolution and external political pressures. Clans, from the Gaelic clan, meaning children or family, organized social relationships around patrilineal descent from common ancestors, creating kinship networks that provided mutual support and collective identity. Each clan recognized a chief whose authority derived from both genealogical legitimacy and personal capabilities, his leadership requiring constant demonstration through hospitality, military success, and protection of clan members. The chief's household included not only family members but also bards, musicians, and warriors whose services reinforced clan identity and military capability. Below the chief, tacksmen, cadets of the chiefly family who held substantial lands, served as intermediaries between the chief and ordinary clan members, collecting rents, organizing military levies, and maintaining social order within their territories. Ordinary clan members, the clansmen who formed the majority of Highland population, held land through customary tenure that guaranteed their occupancy as long as they fulfilled obligations to the chief and tacksmen. These obligations included military service, payment of rents in kind, and participation in communal agricultural labor. The Highland economy during this period centered on cattle herding, with transhumance practices that moved livestock to high summer pastures while cultivating oats and barley in valley floors. The relative poverty of Highland agriculture compared to lowland farming reflected not merely technological backwardness but fundamental environmental constraints. Thin soils, short growing seasons, and heavy rainfall limited agricultural productivity while favoring pastoral activities that could exploit extensive upland grazing resources. Warfare formed an integral component of clan society, with cattle raiding serving both economic and social functions that reinforced clan identity and martial values. These raids, known as reaving or creech, targeted the livestock of rival clans or lowland communities, redistributing wealth while providing young men with opportunities to demonstrate martial prowess essential for achieving status within the warrior-oriented clan hierarchy. The ritualized nature of much Highland warfare, with its emphasis on personal combat and cattle raiding rather than territorial conquest, reflected social values that prioritized martial honor and clan prestige over the systematic political objectives characteristic of feudal conflict. However, this characterization should not minimize the very real violence and destruction that Highland warfare inflicted on communities throughout the region. The wars of Scottish independence during the late 13th and early 14th centuries profoundly impacted Highland society while demonstrating both Highland military capabilities and the complex relationship between Highland clans and Scottish royal authority. When English King Edward I attempted to assert feudal superiority over Scotland following disputed succession to the Scottish throne, his military campaigns devastated southern Scotland while provoking fierce Scottish resistance led initially by William Wallace and subsequently by Robert the Bruce. Highland clans participated in these independence struggles, though their involvement reflected local calculations of advantage rather than straightforward patriotic sentiment. Some clans supported the English cause, recognizing opportunities to pursue feuds with rival clans or advance territorial ambitions under English patronage, while others embraced Scottish independence as defense against external domination that threatened traditional Highland autonomy. The reign of Robert Bruce and his successors involved ongoing efforts to extend royal authority into Highland territories through a combination of military pressure, feudal land grants, and diplomatic arrangements with cooperative chiefs. However, the geographical barriers separating Highlands from centers of royal power, combined with the limited administrative capacities of medieval Scottish monarchy, meant that effective royal control remained tenuous in many Highland regions. The Lords of the Isles, the powerful chiefs of Clan Donald who controlled extensive territories in the Hebrides and Western Highlands, operated with virtual independence from royal authority during much of the 14th and 15th centuries, their maritime power enabling them to pursue diplomatic relationships with England and Ireland that sometimes conflicted with Scottish royal interests. The Lordship of the Isles represented the most significant autonomous Highland political entity during the late medieval period, its rulers exercising sovereign authority over territories that encompassed the entire Hebridean archipelago along with substantial portions of the western Highland mainland. The lords maintained sophisticated administrative systems that blended Gaelic traditional governance with feudal elements, their courts settling disputes according to Gaelic legal traditions while their military forces commanded respect throughout northern Scotland. The cultural patronage of the MacDonald lords supported Gaelic literary and musical traditions, with their courts attracting bards, harpers, and scholars who preserved and developed Highland cultural heritage. However, the independent power wielded by the Lords of the Isles ultimately proved unacceptable to Scottish monarchs who viewed Highland autonomy as threats to royal authority. The forfeiture of the Lordship of the Isles in 1493, when King James IV stripped the MacDonald chiefs of their titles and lands following decades of conflict with royal authority, marked a turning point in Highland-Lowland relations. The removal of this powerful political structure created power vacuums in the Hebrides and Western Highlands that fueled decades of clan warfare as competing families, including the MacDonalds of various branches, the Campbells, the Macleans, and numerous others, struggled for dominance in territories formerly controlled by the lords. Royal attempts to impose administrative control over these regions through appointed officials and military expeditions proved largely ineffective, as the geographical isolation and cultural distinctiveness of Highland territories frustrated efforts at systematic governance. The Protestant Reformation that transformed Scottish religion during the 16th century created new sources of tension between Highlands and Lowlands, as religious changes that gained rapid acceptance in Lowland Scotland faced significant resistance in Highland regions. The Reformation in Scotland, led by firebrand preacher John Knox and supported by powerful lowland nobles who resented ecclesiastical wealth and French Catholic influence, established Presbyterianism as the kingdom's official religion through a series of parliamentary statutes passed in 1560. These reforms abolished papal authority, suppressed Catholic religious houses, and established Protestant theology and worship according to Calvinist principles. However, in many Highland regions, Catholicism retained strong support, partially reflecting conservative attachment to traditional religious practices, but also representing broader Highland resistance to lowland cultural domination. The unification of the Scottish and English crowns under James VI of Scotland, James I of England, in 1603 fundamentally altered Scotland's political status, while creating new dynamics in Highland-Lowland relations. James, educated according to Protestant principles and determined to assert royal authority throughout his kingdoms, pursued increasingly aggressive policies toward Highland clans whose independence he regarded as threats to orderly governance. His Statutes of Iona, promulgated in 1609, sought to undermine traditional Highland culture through requirements that clan chiefs educate their eldest sons in lowland schools, limit their military retinues, suppress bards whose poetic compositions celebrated clan warfare, and support Protestant ministers in their territories. These regulations represented systematic attempts at cultural engineering designed to assimilate Highland society into lowland norms while eliminating traditional practices that royal authorities associated with disorder and backwardness. Highland responses to these pressures varied considerably, with some chiefs adopting strategies of accommodation that involved superficial compliance with royal demands while maintaining traditional practices in private, while others openly resisted policies they viewed as attacks on Highland identity. The Campbells of Argyll, whose territories occupied strategic positions between Highlands and Lowlands, pursued policies of cooperation with royal authority that enabled them to expand their power at the expense of rival clans. The Campbell chiefs accepted Protestantism enthusiastically, educated their sons according to Lowland standards, and supported royal policies in Highland administration, their loyalty rewarded with grants of lands forfeited by less cooperative clans. This Campbell ascendancy created bitter resentments among rival clans who viewed Campbell expansion as betrayal of Highland solidarity in favor of collaboration with alien lowland authority. The outbreak of civil wars in the 1640s, triggered by conflicts between King Charles I and parliamentary forces in England and religious disputes in Scotland, created unprecedented opportunities for Highland clans to pursue their own objectives under cover of larger political conflicts. The Wars of the Three Kingdoms, as scholars now term these complex conflicts that engulfed England, Scotland, and Ireland, involved overlapping religious, constitutional, and ethnic tensions that created shifting alliance patterns as various factions pursued their distinct agendas. In Scotland, the National Covenant of 1638, a religious and political manifesto opposing royal efforts to impose Anglican liturgical practices, attracted widespread lowland support while dividing Highlands between clans that embraced the covenant and those that supported the king for various combinations of religious conviction, traditional royalism, and tactical calculation. James Graham, Marquess of Montrose, emerged as the most significant royalist military leader in Scotland during this period. His brilliant campaigns in the Highlands during 1644 to 1645 achieving spectacular victories against Covenanter forces despite chronic shortages of men and supplies. Montrose's forces included substantial Highland contingents, particularly from clans with Catholic sympathies or histories of conflict with the Presbyterian Campbell establishment. His greatest triumph occurred at the Battle of Inverlochie in February 1645, where his Highland warriors routed a superior Covenanter army led by the Duke of Argyll, killing approximately 1,500 enemies while suffering minimal casualties. The victory demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Highland military tactics. Rapid forced marches across difficult terrain followed by fierce charges that shattered enemy formations before they could organize effective resistance. However, Montrose's ultimate defeat in 1645 and subsequent execution following his capture in 1650 illustrated the limitations of Highland military power against the organized resources of more centralized authorities. The new model army created by English parliamentarians under Oliver Cromwell represented a revolutionary development in military organization. A professional force paid regularly, trained systematically, and commanded by officers selected for competence rather than social status. When Cromwell's armies invaded Scotland in 1650 to 1651, they defeated Scottish royalist forces through superior organization, discipline, and resources, demonstrating that traditional Scottish military capabilities could not match the systematic warfare practiced by modern military establishments. Cromwell's occupation of Scotland included extensive operations in the Highlands, with English garrisons established in fortified positions and punitive expeditions launched against resistant clans, creating bitter memories of English oppression that would fuel Highland anti-English sentiment for generations. The restoration of the Stuart monarchy in 1660 following Cromwell's death and the collapse of the English Commonwealth initially appeared to favor Highland interests, as many clan chiefs had supported the Stuart cause during the civil wars and expected royal rewards for their loyalty. However, King Charles II proved more interested in consolidating royal power and avoiding further conflicts than in rewarding Highland supporters. His religious and political policies prioritizing pragmatic accommodation with powerful English and lowland Scottish interests. The restored regime's policies toward the Highlands continued emphasis on extending royal authority and suppressing traditional practices deemed incompatible with orderly government, disappointing Highland chiefs who had expected greater respect for their autonomy. The religious conflicts that continued to convulse Scotland during Charles II's reign primarily affected lowland regions, where Presbyterian Covenanters faced severe persecution from a regime determined to impose episcopal church governance and royal supremacy over ecclesiastical affairs. The killing time of the 1680s witnessed systematic persecution of Presbyterian dissenters who refused to accept government-appointed clergy, with thousands killed, imprisoned, or transported to colonial servitude. While these religious conflicts primarily affected lowland Scotland, they created deep political divisions that would influence Scottish politics for generations, establishing patterns of Presbyterian opposition to Stuart absolutism that would subsequently shape responses to the Jacobite movements. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 1689, when Protestant English nobles invited William of Orange to depose Catholic King James VII/II, fundamentally transformed British politics while creating circumstances that would precipitate Highland support for the exiled Stuart dynasty. The revolution succeeded relatively bloodlessly in England, where James fled to France after his army collapsed and leading nobles declared the throne vacant. However, in Scotland, substantial support for James remained, particularly in Highland regions where traditional royalism, Catholic sympathies among some clans, and opposition to Presbyterian lowland dominance created powerful motivations for supporting the legitimate Stuart king against what appeared to be a usurpation backed by England and Presbyterian lowlanders. John Graham of Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee, emerged as the leader of Highland support for James VII, raising the Stuart standard in April 1689 and attracting substantial clan support. Dundee's military experience, personal charisma, and commitment to the Stuart cause inspired clans to risk rebellion against the new Williamite regime, their traditional warrior ethos finding expression in loyalty to their legitimate king against foreign usurpers. The campaign culminated at the Battle of Killiecrankie in July 1689, where Dundee's Highland army achieved spectacular victory against government forces commanded by General Hugh Mackay. The Highland Charge, a devastating tactic involving rapid advance downhill followed by fierce hand-to-hand combat, shattered Mackay's infantry formations, killing approximately 2,000 government soldiers while inflicting only 600 casualties on the Highland forces. However, Dundee's death during the battle, mortally wounded at the moment of victory, deprived the Jacobite cause of its most capable military leader. Without Dundee's leadership, the Highland army lost cohesion and strategic direction. Its subsequent defeat at the Battle of Dunkeld by a smaller government force demonstrating the critical importance of effective command for Highland military success. The first Jacobite rising collapsed with Dundee's death, its failure establishing patterns that would recur in subsequent rebellions, initial Highland military success followed by ultimate defeat due to limited resources, inadequate organization, and the superior staying power of government forces backed by English financial resources. The massacre of Glencoe in February 1692 represented one of the most notorious atrocities in Scottish history, its circumstances revealing government attitudes toward Highland clans and creating enduring memories of treachery that poisoned relations between Highlands and government authorities. Following the collapse of the First Jacobite Rising, King William's government demanded that all clan chiefs swear oaths of allegiance by January 1, 1692, threatening military action against any clan that failed to comply. Mackian, chief of a small sept of Clan Donald living in Glencoe, delayed taking the oath due to confusion about proper procedures, eventually swearing allegiance several days after the deadline. Despite his compliance, government authorities decided to make an example of the MacDonalds of Glencoe to terrorize other clans into submission. Soldiers commanded by Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon, a Campbell officer whose family name made him particularly hateful to the MacDonalds, accepted Highland hospitality in Glencoe for nearly 2 weeks, during which the MacDonalds entertained their guests according to traditional customs that required generous treatment of visitors. On the night of February 13th, acting on written orders from their superiors, the soldiers turned on their hosts, killing Mackian and approximately 40 clan members in their beds while forcing others to flee into blizzard conditions where many more perished from exposure. The massacre violated fundamental Highland customs regarding hospitality and guest rights, its calculated treachery creating deep impressions of government perfidy that subsequent Jacobite propaganda would exploit effectively. The Act of Union in 1707, which merged the Scottish and English parliaments to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain, provoked widespread opposition throughout Scotland but particularly intense resistance in Highland regions. The Union abolished the Scottish Parliament, transferring legislative authority to Westminster while promising Scottish representation in the British Parliament and preservation of distinctive Scottish legal and religious institutions. Lowland commercial interests generally supported Union, recognizing economic advantages from access to English colonial markets and financial resources. However, many Scots, both Lowland and Highland, regarded Union as a betrayal of Scottish independence, particularly given allegations of bribery influencing parliamentary votes in favor of Union. In the Highlands, Union appeared as another English imposition that threatened traditional society while subordinating Scottish interests to English dominance. The Jacobite Rising of 1715 represented the first major attempt to restore the Stuart dynasty following the Act of Union and the Hanoverian succession that brought George I to the British throne in 1714. John Erskine, Earl of Mar, raised the Stuart standard in September 1715, attracting substantial Highland support along with some Lowland adherents. Mar's forces initially achieved considerable success, occupying Perth and controlling much of Highland Scotland, while government forces struggled to organize effective resistance. However, Mar proved an incompetent military commander whose indecisiveness squandered the strategic advantages of superior numbers and initial momentum. The Battle of Sheriffmuir in November 1715 resulted in tactical stalemate despite Jacobite numerical superiority. Mar's failure to achieve decisive victory, allowing government forces to regroup while disappointing Highland warriors who expected aggressive leadership. The Rising collapsed in early 1716 when James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender whose claim to the throne provided the Jacobite cause its legitimacy, arrived in Scotland only to find his supporters demoralized and government forces consolidating control. James's uninspiring personality and poor health disappointed followers who had expected charismatic leadership. His decision to return to exile in France after only 6 weeks in Scotland, effectively abandoning his supporters to government retribution. The failure of the 1715 Rising resulted in extensive punishment for participating clans, with estates forfeited, leaders executed or exiled, and military expeditions launched to suppress residual resistance. General Wade's road-building program in the Highlands during the 1720s and 1730s aimed at improving military access to previously isolated regions, facilitating rapid movement of government forces while undermining traditional Highland advantages in difficult terrain. The Jacobite Rising of 1745 represented the final and most serious attempt to restore the Stuart dynasty, its dramatic successes and ultimate catastrophic failure creating enduring legends that have shaped subsequent perceptions of Highland history. Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, landed in the Hebrides in July 1745 with only a handful of companions, his quixotic enterprise initially attracting skepticism even from Highland chiefs who had supported previous risings. However, Charles's personal charisma and promises of French military support eventually convinced several major clans to risk rebellion, their traditional royalism and dissatisfaction with the Hanoverian regime overcoming prudent calculation of likely outcomes. Cameron of Lochiel's decision to support the rising proved particularly significant, his reputation for judgment convincing other chiefs that success might be achievable. The Highland Army's rapid advance into lowland Scotland achieved spectacular success beyond the most optimistic predictions. The capture of Edinburgh in September 1745 provided the Jacobites with Scotland's capital and administrative centre, their control over the city lending legitimacy to Charles's claim while demonstrating government weakness. The Battle of Prestonpans later in September resulted in stunning Highland victory over government forces commanded by Sir John Cope, the Highland charge breaking disciplined infantry formations within 15 minutes and inflicting approximately 500 casualties while suffering fewer than 100 losses. These early successes created dangerous illusions about Jacobite military capabilities, encouraging the fateful decision to invade England in hopes of sparking a general uprising against the Hanoverian regime. The Highland armies march south into England during autumn 1745 represented the high point of Jacobite military success, their forces advancing as far as Derby, approximately 125 miles from London, before retreating in face of superior government forces and the failure of expected English support to materialize. The decision to retreat proved enormously controversial among Jacobite leaders, with Charles favoring continued advance toward London while his Scottish commanders insisted on withdrawal to Scotland where they could maintain their strength while awaiting promised French assistance. The retreat transformed strategic initiative to government forces under the Duke of Cumberland, who pursued the retreating Jacobites with methodical determination while avoiding the pitched battles that Highland forces might win through their devastating charge tactics. The Battle of Culloden on April 16, 1746, fought on open moorland near Inverness that negated traditional Highland tactical advantages, resulted in catastrophic defeat that destroyed the Jacobite army and ended hopes of Stuart restoration. Cumberland's forces, numbering approximately 9,000 well-supplied and disciplined soldiers supported by artillery, faced a Highland army of similar size that had been weakened by desertion, hunger, and a disastrous night march that left men exhausted before battle commenced. The government artillery bombardment inflicted terrible casualties on Highland lines standing immobile on open ground, their discipline crumbling as men died under fire they could not return. When the Highland charge finally commenced, Cumberland's infantry maintained their formations, delivering disciplined volleys that decimated Highland ranks before hand-to-hand combat could decide the engagement. The battle lasted less than an hour, ending in complete Highland rout with approximately 1,500 Jacobites killed against fewer than 300 government casualties. The aftermath of Culloden witnessed systematic repression designed not merely to punish rebellion but to destroy the social foundations of Highland military power. Cumberland's forces pursued defeated Jacobites across the Highlands, killing wounded men on the battlefield and hunting fugitives through the glens. The government implemented policies specifically targeting Highland culture. The Act of Proscription in 1746 banned Highland dress, prohibited possession of weapons, and attempted to suppress Gaelic language and traditional clan organization. These measures represented cultural warfare designed to Anglicize Highland society through forced elimination of distinctive cultural practices, their implementation creating bitter resentments that persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed. The forfeiture of Jacobite estates transferred enormous Highland territories from traditional chiefs to government control, fundamentally altering property relationships and social structures. The forfeited estates commission administered these lands according to improving principles that emphasized commercial agriculture, industrial development, and cultural transformation. The commission's policies introduced lowland agricultural techniques, established schools teaching English and useful trades, and funded infrastructure projects including roads, bridges, and planned villages. While these developments created some economic benefits, they simultaneously undermined traditional social relationships by treating land as commercial property rather than the patrimony of kinship groups. Chiefs who retained their estates increasingly adopted lowland attitudes toward land management, transforming themselves from patriarchal leaders responsible for clan welfare into commercial landlords maximizing rental income from their properties. The military recruitment of Highland regiments by the British Army during the mid-18th century represented a remarkable reversal that transformed former rebels into valued imperial soldiers. The government recognized that Highland martial traditions and warrior culture, previously viewed as threats to civil order, could be channeled into military service that utilized Highland capabilities while removing potential sources of domestic unrest. The raising of Highland regiments began during the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, with units like the Black Watch, Fraser's Highlanders, and Montgomery's Highlanders serving with distinction in North America and elsewhere. Highland soldiers demonstrated exceptional abilities in wilderness warfare, their cultural background preparing them for the privations and irregular tactics required in colonial conflicts. The transformation of Highlanders from rebels to loyal imperial soldiers involved complex processes of cultural negotiation. Highland regiments were permitted to wear modified versions of traditional Highland dress, the kilt and tartan that had been banned for civilian wear, creating symbolic continuity with martial traditions while subordinating them to British military authority. Regimental pipers maintained Highland musical traditions within military contexts, their music evoking emotional connections to Highland heritage while celebrating military prowess in service of the British state. The military channel for Highland masculinity proved highly successful, with Highland regiments earning fearsome reputations in conflicts worldwide, while providing economic opportunities for men from impoverished Highland communities. However, military recruitment created its own social costs, draining Highland populations of young men while reinforcing gender imbalances that affected marriage patterns and community stability. The recruitment of entire companies from single estates created devastating losses when regiments suffered heavy casualties, with battles like Ticonderoga in 1758 nearly destroying Fraser's Highlanders and eliminating entire generations of young men from particular glens. The families of soldiers received minimal support, with military pensions inadequate for maintaining dependents whose menfolk died or became disabled in imperial service. The glorification of military service in Highland culture, promoted by both military recruiters and Highland communities seeking sources of pride in their identity, created powerful pressures on young men to enlist despite the very real dangers of military life. The Highland clearances, which depopulated vast areas of the Highlands during the late 18th and 19th centuries, represented one of the most traumatic episodes in Scottish history, their social and cultural consequences remaining subjects of bitter controversy. The clearances involved systematic removal of Highland populations from traditional lands to facilitate conversion of agricultural systems from subsistence farming and cattle herding to commercial sheep ranching. Landlords, including both traditional chiefs who had transformed into commercial landowners and external purchasers who acquired Highland estates, determined that sheep farming promised greater profits than traditional agricultural systems that supported large populations of tenant farmers. The economic logic of improvement agriculture, imported from lowland Scotland and England, treated land primarily as a source of rental income rather than the material basis for maintaining traditional social relationships. The implementation of clearances varied considerably across the Highlands, ranging from relatively voluntary arrangements where landlords offered assisted emigration and alternative employment, to violent forced removals where tenants were evicted from their homes with minimal notice or compensation. The Sutherland clearances, conducted on the vast estates of the Countess of Sutherland during the 1810s and 1820s, represented the most extensive and controversial removals. Patrick Seller, the estate factor responsible for implementing clearances in Strathnaver in 1814, employed brutal tactics that included burning houses to force out reluctant tenants, his actions resulting in deaths of elderly residents unable to evacuate quickly. Seller's subsequent trial for culpable homicide resulted in acquittal despite clear evidence of his ruthless methods, the verdict reflecting judicial bias favoring landlord interests over tenant rights. The cleared populations faced impossible choices. Accept resettlement in coastal villages where estate managers expected them to support themselves through fishing and kelp harvesting, emigrate to British colonies in North America or Australia, or attempt to survive in even more marginal highland territories. The coastal resettlement schemes generally failed to provide viable livelihoods, as highland populations lacked fishing expertise and equipment while kelp harvesting, which had temporarily flourished during the Napoleonic Wars when import restrictions created demand for domestic kelp as a source of industrial chemicals, collapsed after 1815 when peace restored access to cheaper foreign sources. The inadequate crofts allocated to resettled populations could not support families, creating dependence on wage labor from seasonal migration to lowland harvests or industrial employment that disrupted family life and community stability. Emigration removed hundreds of thousands of Highlanders from their ancestral territories during the 19th century, creating diaspora communities throughout the British Empire and beyond. Emigrants to British North America established Highland settlements in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Ontario, and other Canadian provinces, maintaining Gaelic language and cultural traditions in new environments while adapting to colonial circumstances. Highland emigrants to Australia and New Zealand similarly preserved elements of their cultural heritage, their communities maintaining connections to Scottish origins through cultural associations, churches, and periodic visits. The United States attracted enormous numbers of Scottish emigrants, both Highland and Lowland, who contributed to American development while maintaining varying degrees of Scottish ethnic identity. The potato blight that devastated Ireland during the 1840s created similarly catastrophic conditions in the Highlands, where populations had become increasingly dependent on potatoes as a subsistence crop. The Highland potato famine, though less well known than its Irish counterpart, created mass starvation and accelerated emigration from already impoverished communities. Highland landlords and government authorities responded to the famine with characteristic callousness, viewing the crisis as an opportunity to accelerate clearances and population reduction rather than a humanitarian disaster requiring emergency relief. The Central Board for Highland Destitution, established to coordinate relief efforts, provided some assistance but attached conditions designed to encourage emigration, offering passage money to tenants willing to leave permanently while providing only minimal support to those who remained. The crofting system that emerged in the Highlands during the 19th century created distinctive patterns of land tenure that differed fundamentally from both traditional clan relationships and lowland agricultural arrangements. Crofts, small agricultural holdings typically ranging from 2 to 10 acres, provided insufficient land for economic independence, forcing crofters to supplement agricultural production with wage labor, fishing, or cottage industries. The insecurity of crofting tenure, with landlords retaining rights to evict tenants without compensation for improvements, created constant anxiety while discouraging investment in agricultural improvements. Crofters paid rents in cash rather than in kind or labor, their need for money income forcing participation in market economies while maintaining subsistence agricultural production that barely sustained families. The crofters' resistance movement that emerged during the 1880s, inspired by Irish Land League agitation, challenged landlord power through coordinated rent strikes, illegal occupation of lands from which families had been cleared, and political organization demanding land reform. The Battle of the Braes in April 1882, when crofters in Skye resisted eviction by physically confronting police sent to serve summonses, marked a turning point that demonstrated Highland determination to resist further dispossession. The incident attracted national and international attention, generating sympathetic coverage in newspapers that portrayed crofters as victims of oppressive landlords. Subsequent confrontations, including the Battle of Greenyards in 1884, maintained pressure on government authorities while demonstrating that Highland populations would no longer passively accept landlord dictates. The appointment of the Napier Commission in 1883 to investigate crofting conditions represented government recognition that Highland land questions required systematic attention. The Commission's report, published in 1884, documented extensive grievances including insecure tenure, excessive rents, inadequate land allocations, and the continuing trauma of historical clearances. The Crofters Holdings Act of 1886 provided significant reforms including security of tenure, fair rent determination by independent commissions, and compensation for improvements. While falling short of crofter demands for land redistribution, the Act established legal protections that significantly improved crofter conditions while legitimizing crofting as a distinctive form of land tenure worthy of legal recognition. The cultural revival that occurred in the Highlands during the 19th century created new forms of Highland identity that paradoxically celebrated Highland culture while transforming it into romanticized spectacle divorced from its original social contexts. The invention of romantic Highland traditions by Lowland and English enthusiasts created tartans, clan associations, and Highland games that bore limited relationships to historical Highland culture but satisfied growing demands for Celtic exoticism. Sir Walter Scott's novels, particularly Waverley, 1814, and Rob Roy, 1817, introduced English-speaking audiences to romanticized versions of Highland history that emphasized noble savagery, picturesque landscapes, and tragic heroism. These literary representations proved enormously influential in shaping external perceptions of Highland culture, while influencing how Highlanders themselves understood their heritage. Queen Victoria's enthusiasm for the Highlands, exemplified by her purchase of Balmoral Castle in 1852 and frequent Highland holidays, made Highland culture fashionable among British elites while accelerating its transformation into tourist spectacle. The royal family's adoption of Highland symbols, including tartan, kilts, and bagpipes, granted these formerly rebel associations respectable status while divorcing them from their original social contexts. Highland estates became fashionable purchases for wealthy lowlanders and English aristocrats who valued them primarily as sporting properties for deer stalking and grouse shooting, their commercial value deriving from recreational opportunities rather than agricultural productivity. This transformation of Highland land into sporting playgrounds for wealthy outsiders completed the disconnection between land and the traditional social relationships that had historically characterized Highland society. The Gaelic language experienced precipitous decline during the 19th and early 20th centuries as economic pressures, educational policies, and cultural Anglicization combined to undermine its social base. The Education, Scotland Act of 1872, which established universal compulsory education, made no provision for Gaelic medium instruction, requiring all teaching to occur in English. Highland children who arrived at school speaking only Gaelic faced teachers who often actively discouraged or punished Gaelic use, regarding it as a backward tongue that hindered progress. Parents, recognizing that English proficiency offered their children greater economic opportunities, often reluctantly acquiesced in educational policies that undermined their native language. The number of Gaelic speakers declined from approximately 250,000 in 1881 to fewer than 80,000 by 1971, with the language increasingly confined to elderly speakers in the most remote Highland and island communities. The First World War created demographic catastrophes in Highland communities that had already suffered population decline through emigration and clearances. Highland regiments suffered disproportionate casualties, their tactical roles as assault infantry resulting in devastating losses during futile attacks on entrenched positions. The Highland Territorial Battalions raised from particular districts and estates lost entire companies at battles like Luce and the Somme, eliminating entire generations of young men from specific glens and islands. Small communities that had contributed dozens of volunteers found their war memorials listing 20 or 30 names from populations of only a few hundred. Losses that destroyed families, eliminated potential marriages, and undermined social cohesion already strained by economic pressures. The interwar period witnessed continued Highland depopulation as economic depression created conditions even more difficult than those of the 19th century. The collapse of agricultural prices during the 1920s and 1930s reduced farm incomes to unsustainable levels while fishing communities faced similar pressures from declining fish stocks and competition for more efficient operations. The Highland economy offered minimal employment opportunities beyond subsistence agriculture, forcing young people to seek work in lowland cities or emigrate overseas. The romantic image of the Highlands promoted by tourism coexisted with grinding poverty and limited prospects that characterized actual Highland communities, creating stark contrasts between external perceptions and lived realities. The establishment of the Highlands and Islands Development Board in 1965 represented government recognition that Highland economic development required coordinated intervention and substantial public investment. The board's mandate included supporting existing industries, attracting new investment, improving infrastructure, and preserving Highland culture and environment. The programs achieved mixed success, supporting some industries while failing to stem overall population decline, improving roads and communications while unable to create sufficient employment opportunities. The fundamental challenges of highland economic development, geographical isolation, limited natural resources beyond scenery, small scattered populations, proved resistant to policy interventions that had succeeded in other contexts. The discovery of North Sea oil during the 1970s created new economic opportunities for some highland communities, particularly those with deep water harbors suitable for oil industry facilities. Ports including Kishorn and Nig became centers for construction of offshore oil platforms, providing temporary employment for thousands of workers and creating brief periods of prosperity. However, the oil boom proved transient, with construction contracts completed and employment disappearing once platforms were deployed. The hoped-for lasting economic transformation failed to materialize, leaving highland communities with improved but underutilized infrastructure, while populations continued declining as young people sought opportunities elsewhere. The crofting system, despite its 19th-century origins in social conflict and landlord expediency, became increasingly valued during the late 20th century as a distinctive form of land tenure that preserved highland communities and cultural traditions. Government policies increasingly supported crofting through subsidies, development grants, and regulatory protections that recognized its social and cultural value beyond purely economic considerations. The integration of crofting into European Union agricultural support systems provided financial resources that helped sustain populations in marginal agricultural areas while maintaining cultural landscapes valued for their scenic and heritage qualities. However, crofting faced ongoing challenges from declining agricultural incomes, difficulties attracting young people to agricultural livelihoods, and tensions between traditional practices and environmental conservation objectives. The Gaelic language revival that commenced during the late 20th century represented concerted efforts to reverse historical decline through education, media, and governmental support. The establishment of Gaelic medium education in both Highland and Lowland communities created opportunities for language transmission to children from non-Gaelic-speaking families, producing new generations of speakers whose acquisition of Gaelic reflected cultural commitment rather than heritage transmission. The creation of BBC Radio Nan Gaedhil in 1985 and BBC Alba television channel in 2008 provided Gaelic language media that served existing speakers while raising the language's profile and demonstrating its viability as a medium for contemporary communication. The Gaelic Language, Scotland, Act of 2005 granted Gaelic official status and required public bodies to develop Gaelic language plans, providing legislative recognition previously lacking. Contemporary Highland identity reflects complex negotiations between historical memories, romantic traditions, economic realities, and cultural aspirations. The Highlands attract substantial tourism based on scenery, history, and cultural heritage, this industry providing significant employment while creating dependencies on external perceptions of Highland authenticity. Highland communities balance preservation of cultural traditions with participation in modern economies, their residents maintaining emotional connections to place and heritage while adapting to contemporary circumstances. The land reform legislation passed by the Scottish Parliament since devolution has enabled some Highland communities to purchase their estates through community land trusts, creating new forms of local control that resonate with historical ideals of communal land tenure while adapting them to contemporary legal and economic frameworks. The question of Highland identity in the 21st century involves ongoing debates about authenticity, commodification, and cultural survival. Tourism marketing emphasizes romantic Highland imagery, kilts, bagpipes, castles, and dramatic landscapes that satisfies visitor expectations while sometimes obscuring the complex realities of contemporary Highland life. Highland communities participate in this cultural economy while maintaining awareness that external romantic fantasies often differ substantially from their lived experiences. The tension between preserving cultural traditions and adapting to economic necessities creates ongoing challenges for communities attempting to maintain populations while respecting historical identities. The Highland clearances continue generating controversy as descendants of cleared populations maintain emotional connections to ancestral territories from which their forebears were forcibly removed. Monuments commemorating clearance victims mark sites of historical traumas, their inscriptions recalling injustices that continue resonating in collective memory. The comparison between highland clearances and genocidal policies implemented elsewhere remains contested, with some scholars arguing that clearances constituted cultural genocide while others emphasize economic motivations and reject comparisons with ethnic cleansing. These debates reflect broader questions about historical responsibility, collective memory, and appropriate responses to historical injustices. The natural environment of the highlands has become increasingly valued for conservation purposes, creating new tensions between environmental protection and economic development. The designation of large areas as national parks, nature reserves, and other protected categories restricts certain forms of development while supporting tourism and recreation industries. Rewilding initiatives propose restoring highland ecosystems to more natural states through reintroduction of native species including wolves and lynx, proposals that generate both enthusiasm from conservationists and concern from farming communities worried about impacts on livestock. These environmental debates reflect fundamental questions about appropriate relationships between humans and nature, the extent to which landscapes should be managed for human purposes versus allowed to develop according to natural processes. The renewable energy industry has transformed highland landscapes through development of wind farms, hydroelectric schemes, and other facilities that generate clean energy while creating visual impacts on valued landscapes. These developments produce both economic benefits through employment and community investments, and controversies regarding appropriate balances between environmental imperatives and landscape preservation. Highland communities often find themselves divided between those welcoming economic opportunities and those concerned about industrialization of landscapes valued for their scenic qualities. The political status of Scotland, including its relationship with the United Kingdom and the possibility of independence, directly affects Highland communities whose economic dependencies on both Scottish and UK governmental support create stakes in constitutional arrangements. The Scottish independence referendum of 2014, which resulted in 55% voting to remain in the UK, revealed divisions within the Highlands as some communities supported independence while others valued UK connections. The 2016 Brexit referendum, in which Scotland voted to remain in the European Union while the UK as a whole voted to leave, created new constitutional tensions with implications for Highland communities dependent on European agricultural subsidies and access to European markets. The COVID-19 pandemic that emerged in 2020 created particular challenges for Highland communities dependent on tourism while also demonstrating resilience and adaptability. The collapse of tourist industries during lockdown periods created economic crises for communities heavily dependent on hospitality employment, while the pandemic's health impacts proved relatively limited in sparsely populated highland areas with lower infection rates than urban centers. The pandemic accelerated existing trends toward remote working, creating opportunities for highland repopulation, as workers no longer requiring physical office presence could reside in highland locations while maintaining employment with distant employers. The future of the Highlands depends on addressing fundamental challenges of sustainable economic development, cultural preservation, demographic renewal, and environmental conservation. Highland communities demonstrate remarkable resilience and adaptability. Their histories of survival through clearances, wars, economic depressions, and cultural pressures creating foundations for confronting contemporary challenges. The preservation of Gaelic language and culture requires ongoing commitment and resources while respecting that cultural vitality requires adaptation rather than mere preservation of historical forms. Economic development must balance environmental sustainability with provision of employment opportunities that enable young people to remain in or return to Highland communities. The story of the Highlands from ancient Celtic tribes to contemporary communities illustrates the resilience of human societies, adapting to challenging environments, while maintaining cultural distinctiveness against enormous pressures. Through Roman invasions, Norse settlements, clan warfare, Jacobite rebellions, clearances, and economic transformations, Highland communities have endured, adapted, and maintained connections to ancestral territories and cultural traditions. This continuity within change represents the Highlands' greatest achievement and most valuable lesson, that cultural identities can survive historical traumas while evolving to meet contemporary circumstances. The Highlands today attract visitors seeking connections with heritage, experiences of dramatic landscapes, and encounters with living cultures that maintain threads of continuity extending back millennia. Behind tourist imagery of kilts and bagpipes lie complex realities of communities balancing tradition and modernity, preservation and development, local and global. The romanticism that surrounds the highlands obscures real challenges while celebrating undeniable beauties, both natural and cultural, that make this region distinctive. The continuing vitality of Highland identity, despite historical traumas and ongoing challenges, testifies to human resilience and the enduring power of cultural tradition adapted to changing circumstances. Understanding Highland history requires moving beyond romantic myths to engage with complex realities of social conflict, cultural transformation, and human adaptation. The clearances were neither inevitable nor justified by economic progress, their human costs creating traumas transmitted across generations. The Jacobite risings represented not merely romantic adventures but serious attempts to restore legitimate monarchy and resist alien impositions. The transformation of clan chiefs into commercial landlords reflected broader processes of capitalist development that subordinated traditional social relationships to market logics. The decline of Gaelic resulted from systematic policies designed to eliminate cultural distinctiveness rather than natural evolution. Yet Highland history also demonstrates remarkable cultural resilience and adaptive capacity. The preservation of Gaelic against enormous pressures testifies to the power of cultural commitment. The maintenance of Highland identity through centuries of dispossession and cultural assault demonstrates that human communities can endure historical traumas while transmitting heritage to subsequent generations. The contemporary revival of Highland culture through education, arts, and community development illustrates possibilities for cultural renewal even after apparent collapse. These achievements provide hope that cultural diversity can survive globalization while adapting to contemporary circumstances. The Highlands remain contested spaces where different visions of appropriate futures compete, between economic development and environmental conservation, traditional practices and modern innovations, local control and external investment. These tensions create both challenges and opportunities, their resolution requiring dialogue, compromise, and respect for diverse perspectives. The future of the Highlands will be shaped by choices made by current generations about how to balance competing values while maintaining what makes the region distinctive. As you drift towards sleep, consider the countless generations who have inhabited these glens and mountains, each facing their own challenges while maintaining connections to place and culture that transcend individual lifetimes. Their stories of survival, resistance, adaptation, and endurance demonstrate human capacities for maintaining identity against overwhelming odds. The Highlands' dramatic landscapes witnessed both terrible traumas and remarkable achievements, their beauty coexisting with hard realities of existence in challenging environments. The peoples who shaped Highland history, Picts, Scots, Norse, clan warriors, cleared tenants, crofters, emigrants, and contemporary residents, all contributed to creating the cultural heritage that makes this region unique. Sleep now with awareness that Highland identity continues evolving, its future being written by communities that maintain emotional and cultural connections to ancestral territories while adapting to contemporary realities. The story of the Highlands remains unfinished, its next chapters dependent on choices yet to be made about preservation and development, tradition and innovation, connection and change. May your dreams carry you through mist-shrouded glens and over ancient mountains, where the echoes of pipers and the memories of generations create a cultural landscape as enduring as the granite peaks themselves.